Hi there, welcome to another video from the Vickers MG Collection of Research Association. This is another of our videos looking at the How Let Loose British faction weapons. And this is the one where we're going to talk about the submachine guns. So Matt Moss from the Armourers Bench has joined me again. Matt's a member of the association, comes and gets involved when we need somebody that knows about something that isn't just Vickers machine guns. Matt's one of those guys that we can call upon. So the association's much wider than just a few of us that specialise in the Vickers. But everything obviously comes back to that. We're looking at submachine guns, and they are a late Great War concept that developed. So this subclass of machine guns, submachine guns, the British Army don't call them that, and we'll probably slip into it at some point that we, the British Army, call them machine carbines, because that's just terminology that perhaps more we're comfortable with.
Exactly, and that comes from the interwar period where, you know, the British Army is aware of their existence. They're looking at them. They're testing various ones because obviously, at the end of the Great War, we're looking at the Bergmann MP-18 as being, you know, that iconic submachine gun come to fruition in all the kind of the respects that we understand. It's pistol caliber. It's fully automatic. It's in a small package. It's got a hefty magazine, so it's firepower in the infantryman's hands, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and it's sort of carbine is traditionally the class of weapons that falls between a full rifle and a pistol. Yeah. So you know, carbines have traditionally been shorter rifles, and the British Army are looking at that kind of, it fits in that class rather than a submachine gun, because machine guns to the British Army are the likes of the Vickers, the Lewis, the Bren. And this is not necessarily a subclass of doing that job. This is giving an infantier something between a pistol and a rifle. One of the weapons in the game is the Lanchester machine carbine, and the Lanchester is developed, actually it's sort of that start of that Second World War period, when the British are saying, oh, we've been aware of these submachine guns and we haven't found anything that we like. We've bought some Thompsons, which we'll talk about in a bit, but they're too expensive, so we're going to look at something else. So the Lanchester is a 9mm Parabellum, you know, that standard 9mm ammunition weapon that's being developed in those first few years of the war. It is quite a heavy weapon. It is clearly, you know, it has inspiration from guns like the MP-18, the Bergmann. There are some other interwar period SIG. Is it a SIG?
There's SIGs, there's other Bergmanns, there's a couple of various different ones. The one that's often associated with this is the MP-28.
Okay.
But that is a topic for another video on its own, I
Yeah.
definitely think, because there's a whole history of where does this come from?
Yeah.
Who did we copy this from?
There's a lot of developments unknowns because it happens, you know, this period where we are just looking at lots of different guns, taking flavours from, say, those interwar developments, those international developments as well. It's a weapon that generally goes into service with the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. It's developed with a 50-round magazine. So the magazine is 50 rounds of 9mm ammunition. There's also a very particular requirement or not necessarily particular with this gun, but it will fit the bayonet from the short magazine Lee Enfield rifle. So the No. 1 Mark III or the 1907 pattern bayonet. To the point that there's actually a special contract from, I think it's Winchester, in the Second World War for a number of these bayonets, and they are for the Lanchesters. So suddenly we've made a small, compact submachine gun, very wide and very long. So you can see why we start to talk about machine carbines in this sense rather than submachine guns. So I suppose the only similarity with it being a pistol is the pistol caliber at this point.
Exactly. And the weight of it does have the advantage of making it quite controllable in automatic fire, which is a positive because it is a hefty weight.
Yeah, it's a hefty weight. And it's one of those you sort of have to watch where you're going as to what you're doing with it. So yeah, holding it there, firing it from the shoulder, taking out whoever's next to you with a magazine. So it is a bit peculiar that the Royal Navy adopt this, because if they were using it for shipboarding parties, landing parties and stuff like that, they've made it quite a lack of handleability, quite a cumbersome weapon to move around with. And they've put a bayonet on it as well. And those boarding parties would also be armed with a cutlass. So, you know, harking back to some very traditional approaches to small arms there as well.
Yeah, and I mean, while it seems a bit ludicrous for a boarding party, for a shore party, then it makes a little bit more sense. If you're need to stand off, you've got the bayonet. Um, it it's a really interesting weapon in that also it's so well made. We've got a cast brass bronze magazine housing. We've got this lovely sort of Lee Enfield type
I
stock.
think it is the same, isn't
It's
it?
exactly
Yeah.
the same stock, cut down, reproportioned. It's just a very hefty, really well made weapon, and it quickly becomes clear that this isn't a cost effective way of doing things.
It's a really bizarre one as well. So from a mechanical perspective, it's got this normal simple blowback action, which we'll see on the Stens as we discuss those. But it's got this big lever on the back here as well that I was looking at and think, oh, that's like a selector lever. It's not a selector lever. It's for the brake open.
Yep.
So that you can actually start to strip that. Just put a pin in it. It's one of those, make it simple. There are lots of variations of the Lanchester through development. And we will cover some of those, bringing in some other expertise from the association in a future video as well. But yeah, so this, there you go, potted history of the Lanchester, goes into service, Royal Navy and Royal Air Force, doesn't see Army service.
No. Some commando use early on
Probably
in the war.
from the Navy heritage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But really, you wouldn't have seen it in North Africa.
The other weapon that's in the game, the other submachine gun we've got is actually it's a Mark II Sten, and we've got a few different marks here. We'll apologise for this one. It's a deactivated gun with many of the parts stripped out, and we're using it for instructional purposes, so we've replaced some of those parts with high-coloured resins. But it's a really lightweight submachine gun, machine carbine. It's cheap, easy to make. There are so many stories about some of the development of this and myths, and some truer than others. Like the diameter of this was inspired from the Vickers tripod leg.
That is one of them.
Yeah, it's the same outside diameters, but it's tubing. It's the standard it's the standard internal and external dimensions of a piece of tube in British manufacture at the time. So why consider it was the Vickers tripod leg? I don't know. Maybe somebody did at some point. But yeah, a really lightweight, easy to make gun. Different kinds of stocks were used on it. So there's a Mark II gun, that's a Mark III gun. These stock types, the T or the open section, are interchangeable between the two. But it did change from that 50-round magazine to just a 32-round magazine, typically not used with 32-round magazines. Typically not used with 32 rounds in the magazine because of the strain on the spring. But really short basic sights.
In terms of development, it's essentially it's a simplification of the Lanchester, in that the story goes that the Sten was developed by the engineers that were working on the actual design drawings for the Lanchester, so it could go into production elsewhere.
Because it's right to say that this is the Sten Mark II.
Yes.
The Sten Mark I has wood.
Very different looking beast.
It's like the blowback mechanism's the same.
Exactly. So you've got the exact same tube, you've got the exact same trigger mechanism housing, but you've got a slightly nicer stock. You've got a little wooden fore end here and a folding stock as well. And then the barrel nut extends further forward and becomes a barrel jacket, which is perforated.
Yeah.
And there's a conical flash hider at the end as well. But this is the archetypal utilitarian SMG of World War II, isn't it? It doesn't really get any simpler than this, although it kind of does with the Mark III.
Yeah, so say the Mark II has this reputation of, say, being used with SOE resistance groups because it can be dropped from parachutes, broken down, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it could also be dropped, and it has a myth around that, in that the cocking mechanism on any of these Stens is very simple, and it will, if you drop it while there's a round or there's the magazine in, it will cock itself and it will fire. And there are loads of accounts of injuries of that happening. That happens with most of these open bolt weapons, though. It just happens to be that the Sten is the one that exists throughout the Second World War.
And it's made in the millions.
Absolute millions. So, cheap, cheerful, easy to make. Pretty much you could make this in most machinist workshop. The only thing that a gunsmith technology, it doesn't have to be a gunsmith, but the only thing a gunsmith technology needs to do is rifle the barrel. And actually, because of the short length of rifling on that, and actually the quite crude rifling, that can almost be done by hand. The submachine carbines are generally what arms the section commanders. So they have, it's the only other automatic firepower in an infantry section other than the Bren. that only comes in actually sort of mid-war. We can't afford lots of submachine guns to start with. So yeah, it's quite a limited use up to that point. Then we start to see section commanders have it, radio operators, signalers, filling that carbine role. So if you think about those that don't need a rifle but want more than a pistol, it's filling that interim role.
If you've got another job, if you're directing men in action, then you're not necessarily wanting to be looking around a rifle. If you need a little bit of firepower going into a building, into a trench, these are the ideal kinds of weapon.
Yeah, and it might be that the section commander is carrying it because they don't need it all the time, but they're going to hand that off to the person that's going through the door first. Yeah, they're going to carry their own magazines, but they're going to pass that gun over to whoever needs it straight away.
So one of the two British submachine guns that are in game and in both maps is the Sten. The model, it's not bad. It looks pretty good. One thing I did notice when I was watching some clips is when the character goes to reload, he puts the magazine in first and then cocks the weapon.
Okay.
Which, according to drills, it's the other way around.
Yeah.
So you cock the weapon into its safety slot,
Magazine
in, out of the safety slot.
And then it'll fire for it,
Yeah.
And then release the bolt when you pull the trigger.
Exactly. But other than that, it's not bad representation, I don't think.
But it shouldn't be there in the Alamein representation. It's too late. Or actually, at that point, we're using the Thompsons. But drill, actually, we shouldn't be seeing either. Because it's the Sten is too late for Alamein, but it's too early for drill. By that point, the airborne forces, and I know it's not necessarily airborne forces in the game, but by that point, the airborne forces are largely being issued with the Mark V, which is using the number 4 bayonet. There's a bayonet developed for the Mark II. There isn't a bayonet developed for the Mark III, but we're going to use the rifle bayonet on the Mark V, which is, again, sort of much greater finesse than the earlier guns and stays in service until the 50s when it's replaced by the Sterling. But in the meantime, we do have the Mark III being developed as well. So the Mark III is a simpler version again of the Sten. So infantry would have been using the Mark III by that point. Airborne forces the Mark V.
Very true. So we would have seen that in the Northwest Europe theatre, whereas the Thompsons continued in service in Italy and North Africa into 44, I believe, and onwards.
Yeah, so the M1928 Thompson, which is the examples we've got here, were being used by the British all the way through from 1940 in the Middle East and the Far East to some extent. They get replaced by the Stens a bit earlier in the Far East, but in the Middle East and then up through the Mediterranean, so Sicily, Italy, the Thompsons remain quite ever present. In Northwest Europe, really, it's only the commando forces that are using those rather than the Sten.
Heavily favoured, and in fact, they're actually on the commando insignia, aren't they?
Yes, they are. Yeah, of course they are. Combined Operations Insignia is the Thompson. So the one that is in game and is quite a good representation of the gun itself is obviously the Lanchester, but it really shouldn't be in the game. I think having this as an infantry weapon, it's a bit like the P14 that we discussed with the rifles. It just wouldn't have been there. The British Army did not use these in those numbers in the same way that the regular British Army did not use the Pattern 14 Enfield. So it's a really bizarre choice to have this represented in game. It's great that we see it because actually the Lanchester is a small arm that we see very little about. So we've got some good representation from that, but it's just not in the right place. We'd be seeing, like I say, the Thompsons in service. If you want a heavy submachine gun that fires a pistol caliber ammunition, then the Thompsons are the guns to go to. If you want something with a 50 round mag, then obviously you've got a 50 round magazine on a Thompson. So they could have chosen different aspects. With the Thompson, we've got both the straight foregrip, the horizontal foregrip, and the vertical as well. So there's some variation, but we should be seeing these in that Al Alamein map, and we should be seeing perhaps the Mark II Sten as a basic weapon, upgrading perhaps to the Mark III and the Mark V Stens as we progress through the war.
Although one thing I would add there is that the reason I think they've gone with the Lanchester in the British faction is that they wanted a unique British submachine gun that separates it from perhaps the Thompson in the US faction, and that gives it a kind of unique aspect.
It certainly does reinforce that sort of unique British quirkiness, steampunk, Victoriana kind of fascination.
It's very
that
Edwardian
everybody
looking, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah, it certainly reinforces some of those points, which stereotype British small arms. But yeah, we use the Thompsons. We then use the Stens, and we use the Stens continually. So what we're going to do is we're going to take some of these weapons and we're going to run some firing with them and see how they perform. So this is the Sten Mk II, so that cheaper version of the Sten. We've got repetition and automatic on here. So a 32 round mag. We haven't got that in. There's no 32 rounds in there, but we can hold it from the hip. First of all, hold it from the hip. We pull that back. We can fire single shots. Keeping our fingers away from the bolt. Switch to automatic. And we clear it. So we had some feed issues there. Probably magazine lips more than anything. That seems to be the common one for a Sten, or power ammunition. But other than that, it runs quite reliable, nice and easy to fire from the hip, with that magazine resting on the forearm there and the hand gripped around the barrel nut.
The sights are fairly crude, but it's an aperture, so you can pick up the front sight quite easily. It's a relatively low rate of fire, so you can achieve single rounds and short bursts. You can definitely feel the bolt bounce while firing, but all in all, it's a controllable weapon. You just need to be aware of how you're holding it. Too far forward, you're going to touch the hot barrel. Too far back, you can get your finger in the way of the ejection port. One of the things you see a lot in films and on various other outlets is people holding it by the magazine, which is an intuitive way of doing it. So it seems like that's what you're supposed to do, but in reality the pamphlets all talk about holding it at the front by the barrel nut, or occasionally back here on the trigger housing. So it's either like that or more commonly like that, rather than holding it by the magazine. Holding it by the magazine can sometimes lead to stoppages in the feed if you have a particularly tight grip on the magazine, which is easy to do in the heat of the moment. But that's one of the big myths about the Sten, is holding it by the magazine.
So this is the Lanchester machine carbine. So this is the one that's in the game. It's quite a heavy weighty gun, but you hold it here rather than forward of everything because your sling position's there. So we're going to hold it there. Let's give it a look. 50 round magazine. We've got haven't got 50 in there at the moment, but we're going to pop that in. Hold it into position, into the shoulder. It's full auto only. And that's 10 rounds quite quickly, quite easy to support, really nice to hold. You've got that wood and everything of the rifle that's much more comfortable than just metal all the time. So yeah, it's really difficult to get it to fire a single shot for me, but it is possible to do sort of repetition by just manipulating the trigger a lot lighter than what I did there.
So first of all, we're going to fire from the Lanchester's 50 round magazine. Which is a little bit cumbersome. You can definitely feel the weight, and this magazine isn't even fully loaded. So with 50 rounds, you can imagine that the gun would be quite off balance. It's not too difficult to get single shots, even though this is a fully automatic only weapon.
So we're going to try and fire the Lanchester with the bayonet fitted. As we discussed, you can fit the bayonet to the front of it for use for boarding parties, or because you want a submachine gun or a machine carbine with a bayonet. We're going to fire a few rounds from the shoulder with the bayonet fitted. It actually takes out the lift that you'd sort of experience otherwise. It does become a bit difficult to hold in the shoulder when you're firing otherwise, but it takes out that rise from the muzzle quite nicely. So now we're going to fire the Thompson, which isn't in the British faction on the game, but is in the US faction, but would be right for Al Alamein. You know, it is the machine carbine that we were using at that point, and we were using it throughout the war, but not infantry at drill, let's put it that way. So 20 round magazine, 30 rounds also available, 50 round, but we've got 20, not full of 20, but let's give it a go. So I'm going to do a few rounds on single first. And then we're going to switch to automatic. And it opens on there. So that starts to climb on automatic and starts to climb to the right a little bit. Compensator keeps it working quite nicely, but it's a hefty gun, so it feels like you're going to hit where you're pointing it quite nicely.
So the Thompson's interesting in that the magazine has a rib at the back of the magazine, and you slide that into a pair of guides. The weight of the Thompson makes it a really controllable platform. We've got the cuts compensator on this particular M1928 model. It's a controllable gun, but it's very heavy. The length of pull into the shoulder isn't too bad, but if you've got shorter arms, then it could be a bit of an issue. But all in all, it's a really interesting weapon to shoot in that you're able to do single shots relatively easy, and then bursts controllable, but as Rich mentioned, you do start to see the muzzle climb and move off to the right as well.
There we go. That's all the SMGs fired and sort of tested to see how they work in the game. What did you think of that, Matt?
It was illustrative, wasn't it? It was really interesting to fire the Sten alongside the Lanchester, because the Lanchester is always seen as like the Rolls Royce of British submachine guns, with the utilitarian Sten being a little bit more rough and ready. But I don't know what you thought, but I thought the Sten was a little bit handier.
Well, it's lighter.
Exactly.
It is handleable. It seems to be like I could manipulate the trigger on the Sten a lot easier. I will say that firing the Lanchester with a bayonet, though, really dropped that muzzle climb. Yeah. It was much more controllable with the bayonet on the front, which is unexpected. These are the two that's in the game. This is right. This shouldn't be there. But this should be the Thompson. And I've just sort of noticed that's it's not long after we fired. The Thompson's still hot at the front though, whereas the Sten and these others aren't. But that Thompson barrel's still quite warm there. It should be in the game. Great stable gun to fire. The weight just makes it quite intuitive to it's going to fire where you're pointing it at.
I mean, it would be really great if the game included the Thompson. I think that would be, a big improvement. I can understand that they're wanting to have like unique British submachine guns in that class. So perhaps adding the Thompson, it was a bit of a step forward. And we thought, no, we'll stick with two very specifically British guns. But I think there's definitely a place for the Thompson if they wanted to add that in there. But overall, really interesting. And the Thompson, quite controllable. Sten, quite handy. Lanchester, it's got a bayonet.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll go back to the studio and I'll take my ear defenders off because I didn't need them at all during that. So there we go. So we've done some firing. What did you think of that, Matt?
I thought it was really illustrative. I think you can see the differences between the various different submachine guns that we've fired. And, the viewer can go away and compare that to the game and see, and they can decide how accurate the representation in game is.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about submachine guns. There's a lot of misunderstandings about British weapons, which is perhaps, hopefully we've answered some of those in in these videos of studying the British faction and the weapons that they've got with it, because the submachine guns, they're not there for swinging around and blasting. They've got different accuracies all the time. We've seen all that in the firing, so it's really important that that we carry on doing what we do. And we will continue to bring videos like this to people so that they can understand British historic weapons. Obviously, the Vickers machine gun is our focus. All of these weapons were some of the sidearms of the SMGs. So SMGs being machine gunners, they were guns that were used by machine gunners all the time. So we have these in the collection. We will be sharing more about them, particularly in that context. But it's been a great opportunity to look at these through the lens of how let loose and how they're portrayed in the game. So if you'd like to see more of that and how we are firing these guns, how we're maintaining the collection, then we have a number of ways of doing that. The key one is supporting us through Patreon. And please head over to our Patreon page where you'll get access to many of the archive materials that I've discussed in the videos. Support us on whatever level suits you, different benefits and everything doing that. But we also have our project support pages where if there's a particular thing that you think you want to donate to, contribute to, then we crowdfund for things such as the Thompson submachine gun that we've been firing. Hopefully you've enjoyed the series so far. We're going to expand it, include some of the equipment and kit that was there, as well as the uniforms, building on our mannequin machine gunners videos. Thanks very much, Matt, for doing some of these videos with us.
Thanks for having me.
Make sure you go over and follow Matt's channel on the Armourer's Bench. Make sure you like, share, subscribe, and turn on the notifications for these as well, so that you can make sure you don't miss anything in the future.